On a Wednesday morning in January, when most of western Nebraska looked like it had been drained of color, one field outside the town of Broken Bow was still green. Everything around it was brown. Brown corn stalks, brown soybean stubble, brown grass folded flat by wind and frost. The sky was the color of old steel, and the temperature had not climbed above freezing in 6 days. But in the middle of all that winter ground, 80 acres of cereal rye, oats, turnips, and winter peas stood 6 inches tall, and there were cattle on it. 120 black Angus cows moved across the field in a tight group, heads down, pulling at the rye, biting off turnip tops, stepping over corn residue left from the previous harvest. Behind them, the ground looked completely different. Some plants had been eaten. Some had been pushed flat. Corn stalks had been broken and pressed against the soil. Manure dotted the field in dark circles. From the county road, it looked like the cows were destroying the place. That was exactly what one of the neighbors thought. He slowed his truck, rolled down the window, and watched for almost a minute before calling the owner of the farm. He said, "Ray, I think your boy has the cows in the corn ground." Ray Mercer looked out the kitchen window toward the field. He said, "I know." The neighbor waited. Then he said, "On purpose?" Ray looked at the cattle moving behind a single strand of temporary electric fence. He said, "That's the part we're still arguing about." 9 months later, that same field would go through the driest June the Mercer family had seen in 17 years. The corn planted there would stay green almost a week longer than the corn across the fence, and the argument about whether those cattle had damaged the soil would turn into a very different argument about what, exactly, they had done to it. But to understand why Ray Mercer let 120 cows walk onto ground he had spent 40 years trying to protect, you have to understand what had been happening to that farm long before the cattle arrived. The Mercer farm covered a little over 1,600 acres. Most of it was planted in corn and soybeans. The family also kept a cow-calf herd on pasture that ran along the creek and across several pieces of rough ground that were too steep or irregular for row crops. Ray had farmed there his entire adult life. He was 63 years old, careful with money, suspicious of trends, and very good at keeping equipment running long after the manufacturer expected it to be replaced. His father had taught him to plow. His county agent had taught him how to apply fertilizer. His banker had taught him how much yield he needed to make the payments. And the weather had taught him that none of those lessons mattered if the rain did not come at the right time. For most of Ray's career, the system had worked. Plant corn, plant soybeans, apply fertilizer, control weeds, harvest in the fall, leave the ground alone through winter, start again in spring. The yields rose for years. The tractors got larger, the planters got more precise. The seed got better, the fertilizer recommendations became more exact. But something under the surface was slowly getting worse. The first sign was water. A hard summer rain used to disappear into the ground. Now it ran. It moved between the rows, carried soil toward the low spots, and collected in the roadside ditch. On certain fields, a 2-inch storm could leave standing water in one area and dry soil 6 inches below the surface in another. Then there was the crust. After heavy rain, the top half-inch of soil would seal into a hard layer. Corn seedlings sometimes struggled to emerge through it. Ray would walk the field after planting, kick at the surface with his boot, and say the soil was just tight that year. But it was tight the next year, too. Fertilizer costs kept climbing. So did herbicide costs. In dry summers, the corn rolled its leaves by noon and stayed that way until dark. In wet summers, water sat in places where it had never sat before. The farm was still productive. That was important. This was not dead land. It was not abandoned land. It was not a farm on the edge of collapse. It was good land being asked to do the same thing over and over, without much of a break. And good land can hide a problem for a long time. Ray's son, Daniel, came home in the fall of 2018. Daniel was 28 years old. He had worked for 3 years as a crop scout and livestock manager in South Dakota after finishing college. He had not come home because the farm was failing. He came home because Ray's knees were beginning to bother him, because Daniel wanted to raise his own family near the place where he had grown up, and because both men had reached the point where they were willing to admit that the farm would eventually need someone younger. They were not always willing to admit it at the same time. Daniel spent his first year doing what Ray asked. He ran the planter. He repaired fence. He checked cattle. He hauled grain. He attended seed meetings and listened to salesmen explain why the next product would solve the problem created by the last product. But Daniel also started digging holes. He carried a shovel in the back of his truck and stopped in different fields after rain. He looked at roots. He counted earthworms. He pushed a pocket knife into the soil to see where the resistance changed. On one 80-acre field north of the house, the knife stopped at 4 inches. Below that was a dense layer where roots bent sideways instead of growing down. Daniel poured water into a metal ring pushed into the soil and timed how long it took to disappear. Then he did the same test in the old pasture along the creek. The pasture absorbed the water much faster. The pasture had living roots most of the year. It had different grasses, clover, insects, cattle manure, and soil that was rarely left bare. The crop field had corn for part of 1 year, soybeans for part of the next, and nothing living in it for months between harvest and planting. Daniel began to think the cattle and the cropland were not two separate parts of the farm. He began to think they had been separated by habit. The conversation started at the kitchen table in February. Ray was drinking coffee and looking through a machinery catalog. Daniel had a legal pad covered with numbers. That should have been the first warning. Daniel said he wanted to plant a cover crop after wheat harvest on one field and after corn silage on another. Ray kept looking at the catalog. He said, "We don't grow wheat." Daniel said, "We could put some in the rotation." Ray turned the page. Daniel said he also wanted to fly cereal rye into standing corn before harvest. Ray stopped turning pages. He looked at his son and said, "Why?" Daniel explained that he wanted living roots in the ground after the cash crop stopped growing. He wanted the soil covered through winter. He wanted something to take up leftover nutrients, reduce erosion, and feed the soil biology. Ray listened. Then Daniel said the part he had saved for last. He wanted to graze the cover crop with the cow herd. Ray closed the catalog. He said, "You want to put cattle on crop ground?" Daniel said, "For short periods." Ray said, "You want to put 1,200 pounds on 4 hooves and walk it across a field we're trying not to compact." Daniel said the cows would be moved frequently. Ray asked how frequently. Daniel said maybe every day, sometimes twice a day. Ray stared at him. Then he said, "So now we're moving fence twice a day in January." Daniel said, "Maybe." Ray opened the catalog again. He said, "You're making a lot of work to solve a problem you haven't proved we have." Daniel had expected that. He showed his father the infiltration tests. He showed him photographs of roots turning sideways. He showed him the cost of winter hay, the number of days the herd had been fed from the stackyard, and the acres that sat unused after harvest. Ray looked at the numbers longer than Daniel expected. Then he pointed to the page and said, "Cows eat it. Then what?" Daniel said, "They trample some of it." Ray said, "Waste it." Daniel said, "Cover the soil." Ray said, "Same thing with a different name." Daniel said the manure would be distributed across the field instead of collected near winter feeding areas. He said the cattle could convert cover crops into weight and reduce purchased feed. He said their hooves could press residue against the ground, where it would break down instead of blowing into the fence lines. Ray said their hooves could also turn the field into a parking lot. Neither man changed his mind. That might have been the end of it if Daniel had asked to do the whole farm. He did not. He asked for 80 acres, one field, one winter. Ray agreed for the same reason many farmers agree to things they do not believe in. He wanted the argument to produce an answer. There was one more person Daniel had to convince. His name was Curtis Bell, and he had advised the Mercer family on fertilizer and crop management for almost 20 years. Curtis was not a villain. He was not dishonest. He was an experienced agronomist who had seen dozens of ideas arrive with confident claims and disappear after 3 difficult seasons. He had seen farmers lose yield chasing soil health promises they did not fully understand. He had seen cover crops become weeds. He had seen rye survive too long into spring and pull moisture from the seedbed. He had seen cattle pug wet soil so badly that it required tillage to repair. When Daniel told him the plan, Curtis did not laugh. That almost made it worse. He looked across the field and said, "This can work." Daniel smiled. Then Curtis said, "It can also go wrong in about 15 different ways." He explained that grazing was not automatically regenerative just because cattle were involved. If the animals stayed too long, they could eat plants below the point of recovery. If the soil was wet, their weight could cause compaction. If the water source stayed in one place, the cows would concentrate around it. If the cover crop was planted too late, there would not be enough growth to justify grazing. If it was terminated too late, it could interfere with planting. Curtis said, "The cows aren't the system. Your management is the system." Daniel wrote that down. That spring, they planted 40 acres of winter wheat as a trial. After harvest in July, Daniel drilled a mixture of oats, cereal rye, radishes, turnips, crimson clover, and a small amount of sorghum sudangrass. The seed bill bothered Ray. The drilling cost bothered him more. Watching the field through August bothered him most of all, because the cover crop came up unevenly. One part was thick and green. Another looked thin. The radishes grew well in the lower ground. The clover was hard to find. Grasshoppers damaged the oats near the road. Ray drove past it every morning and said nothing. By October, the field looked better. By November, it held enough forage to graze. Daniel installed temporary fence and divided the field into small sections. He ran a water line from a portable tank and put the cows into the first paddock on a cold Monday morning. They did not know what to do. The cows walked the fence. They bawled. Several stood at the gate waiting to be taken back to the pasture where they had always been fed. Then one cow pulled a turnip from the ground. She chewed the top, dropped the root, picked it up again, and ate most of it. Within an hour, the herd was grazing. Daniel watched them like a man waiting for an engine to make a bad noise. The next morning, he moved the fence. The cows stepped into fresh forage and spread out. Behind them, the field was not bare. That was the important part. They had eaten roughly half of what was standing. The rest had been bent, broken, or pressed onto the soil. Manure was scattered through the paddock. The ground remained covered. Ray walked out and looked at it. He said, "They left a lot." Daniel said, "They're supposed to." Ray said, "We paid to grow that." Daniel said, "We also paid to grow corn roots, and we don't harvest those." Ray looked at him. Daniel decided not to say anything else. For the first 2 weeks, the system worked almost exactly as Daniel had hoped. The herd moved every day. Hay feeding stopped. The cows remained in good condition. The soil stayed firm. The portable fence took less time to move once Daniel developed a routine. Then the weather changed. A warm front came through in early December, and dropped nearly 2 inches of rain on ground that had begun to thaw. Daniel knew the field was getting soft. He also knew there were 12 acres left to graze. He told himself the cows would only be there one more day. That one day caused most of the problems. The herd gathered around the water tank. Hooves sank into the wet soil. The same paths were traveled again and again. Near the gate, the ground turned into mud. That evening, the wind pushed a section of temporary fence down. 14 cows stepped across it. They did not go far, but they reached a corner where young trees had been planted as a windbreak. By the time Daniel found them, several trees had been stripped of branches. Ray arrived 10 minutes later. He got out of his truck and looked at the mud near the water tank. Then he looked at the damaged trees. He did not raise his voice. He said, "This is what I was talking about." Daniel had no answer, because Ray was right. The next morning, they pulled the cattle off the field. Daniel walked the muddy area with a shovel. In some places, the damage was shallow. In others, the hoof prints were several inches deep. Curtis came out that afternoon. He looked at the field and said something Daniel did not want to hear. He said, "The cattle didn't make the decision to stay here." Daniel knew what he meant. The mistake was not using cattle. The mistake was leaving them on wet ground because Daniel wanted to finish the plan he had already made. The field had changed, and he had not changed with it. That winter, Daniel rebuilt the grazing plan. He created more exit points so cattle could be removed without crossing the entire field. He placed the water tank on a hardened surface and moved it more often. He reduced the size of each paddock so the herd would distribute manure more evenly. He established a rule that cattle came off whenever the soil began to deform under a boot heel. Ray called it the mud rule. Daniel called it a soil moisture threshold. They were talking about the same thing. In spring, Daniel expected the damaged area to be obvious. Some of it was. The ground around the old water point remained rough and needed to be leveled before planting. But across most of the field, the soil carried a layer of plant residue pressed close to the surface. Underneath that layer, the ground was damp. Across the fence, the untreated field was more exposed. Corn stalks stood upright. Wind had moved leaves and husks into the ditch. Curtis repeated the infiltration test. The difference was not dramatic enough to build a speech around, but it was measurable. Water entered the grazed field faster than it had the year before. The soil under the residue was cooler. The surface crust was weaker. Daniel planted corn into the field without tillage. Ray stood at the edge and watched the planter move through the residue. He had two concerns. The first was whether the planter could place seed at a consistent depth. The second was that his son would interpret any successful emergence as proof that every idea he had ever had was correct. The corn emerged evenly. Daniel wisely celebrated in private. Then June arrived. The first week was hot. The second week was hotter. By the end of the month, rainfall at the farm was less than half the normal amount. Corn on the lighter soils began rolling its leaves before lunch. Pastures slowed down. The creek dropped. Ray started checking the weather forecast several times a day, which did not make it rain but gave him something to be angry at. The 80-acre test field was not immune. That matters. The corn still needed water. The plants still showed stress. The cover crop had not created rain, and the cattle had not performed a miracle. But the field changed more slowly. In the grazed ground, the soil remained damp farther into the afternoon. The residue shaded the surface. Roots had followed old root channels deeper than Daniel had seen in his first shovel tests. Across the fence, the corn began rolling around 10:30 in the morning. In the test field, most of it stayed open until early afternoon. Ray noticed before Daniel said anything. He stopped the truck between the two fields, stepped out, and walked several rows in each direction. He dug with his pocket knife. Then he called Daniel. He said, "Come north." Daniel asked what was wrong. Ray said, "Nothing yet." They stood together in the field. Ray pushed his knife into the soil on one side of the fence, then on the other. He said, "This side is cooler." Daniel said, "There's more cover." Ray said, "I can see that." Daniel waited. Ray dug again. He said, "You think it's the cows?" Daniel gave the most honest answer he had. He said, "I think it's the whole system." The cover crop had put living roots into the ground after harvest. The roots had fed soil organisms and opened pathways through the surface layer. The cattle had consumed part of the plants and returned nutrients in a different form. Their hooves had pressed residue down where it could protect the soil. The grazing income had helped pay for the seed. And because the herd had moved quickly, most of the field had received pressure without being occupied long enough to be destroyed. It was not one practice. It was the connection between practices. That year, the drought reduced yields across the farm. The test field did not produce a record crop. It produced 12 bushels more corn per acre than the comparable field beside it. 12 bushels was useful, but it was not the number that changed Ray's mind. The feed records did. The cattle had grazed for 43 days without being fed hay. Based on the amount of hay normally used during that period, the farm had avoided cutting, baling, hauling, and feeding dozens of tons of stored forage. The manure had been deposited on the field instead of concentrated in the winter lot. The cover crop had cost money. The fence had cost money. Daniel's labor had cost time. But the system had produced feed, soil cover, nutrient cycling, and a cash crop benefit from the same acres. Ray sat at the kitchen table with the records spread in front of him. He worked through the numbers twice. Then he said, "Do it again." Daniel asked, "On the same field?" Ray said, "On 2 fields." That was how the experiment became a program. Over the next 3 years, the Mercers added cover crops gradually. They did not put cattle on every acre. Some fields lacked water access. Some were too far from the home place. Some became too wet in winter. Some years the cover crop did not produce enough growth to graze. They learned to stop pretending that one method had to fit every field. They also learned that the most important grazing decision was often the decision not to graze. When the ground was wet, the cattle stayed off. When forage was short, they moved sooner. When spring arrived dry, they terminated the rye earlier to conserve moisture. When they expected a wet spring, they sometimes let it grow longer to build more biomass. Curtis Bell remained involved through all of it. At first, he came to identify problems. Later, he came to measure results. On the original 80 acres, infiltration continued to improve. Earthworms became easier to find beneath the residue. Water stopped collecting in one of the low areas that had regularly ponded after storms. The soil was not transformed overnight. Organic matter did not double. Fertilizer did not become unnecessary. The Mercers still bought seed. They still used herbicide. They still applied nitrogen to corn. They still relied on machinery, weather forecasts, crop insurance, and a long list of things that could fail at inconvenient times. But the soil began to behave differently, and the farm's expenses began to shift. They purchased less winter feed. They made fewer trips with the manure spreader. They reduced erosion in several vulnerable fields. They gained additional grazing days in years when pasture growth was poor. The cattle, which had once been kept on the least farmable parts of the property, became part of how the best land was managed. The moment the idea spread beyond the Mercer farm came during a field day in late August. About 40 farmers stood near the original test plot while Daniel explained the rotation. Some were interested. Some were skeptical. A few had come mainly because lunch was provided. Daniel showed photographs of the muddy failure from the first winter. He could have left those photographs out. He did not. He said the system had failed because he had treated the grazing schedule like a fixed plan, instead of a decision that depended on soil conditions. Then Curtis stepped forward. Everyone knew Curtis. He had advised farms in the county for decades, and several people in the group expected him to give a warning. He did. He said cattle could compact wet soil. He said cover crops could reduce moisture available to the next crop. He said poorly managed grazing could remove too much residue. Then he pointed toward the field. He said, "All of that is true. It is also true that this soil takes water faster than it did 4 years ago." A farmer near the back asked whether the cattle had caused the improvement. Curtis said, "That's the wrong question." He pointed to the rye residue, the corn roots, the manure, and the portable fence. He said, "The question is whether the parts work better together than they did separately." Ray stood behind the group with his arms crossed. He did not speak during the presentation. After everyone left, he helped Daniel roll up the demonstration fence. He said, "You showed them the mud pictures." Daniel said, "They needed to see them." Ray nodded. Then he said, "Good." The second real test came the following spring. A storm dropped more than 3 inches of rain in less than 2 hours. Water filled the road ditch. Soil washed from several exposed fields nearby. One culvert plugged with corn residue and flooded part of a county road. Daniel drove to the original test field as soon as the rain slowed. Water was moving through it, but slowly. Most of the surface remained protected. The residue broke the impact of the rain. Roots held the soil. Small channels allowed water to enter, instead of racing across the top. At the lower edge of the field, the runoff was clearer than the water coming from the neighboring ground. Ray arrived a few minutes later. The two men stood in the rain, wearing jackets that were no longer waterproof. Ray looked toward the place where water used to collect. There was some standing water, but much less than before. He said, "Remember when I said cows belonged on grass?" Daniel said, "I remember." Ray looked across the field. He said, "I still think they belong on grass." Daniel waited. Ray pointed toward the cover crop growing between the old corn rows. He said, "I just had too narrow an idea of where grass could be." Today, the Mercer cattle still spend most of the growing season on pasture. They have not replaced tractors. They have not eliminated fertilizer. They are not released onto fields without a plan and expected to repair decades of soil damage by simply walking around. They are moved carefully. They are kept off wet ground. They are given only part of the forage because the rest belongs to the soil. Every fall, after harvest, temporary fence appears across several fields. Water lines are checked. Cover crops rise between corn stalks. When enough growth is available and conditions are right, the herd comes through. From the county road, it still looks unusual. A field intended for corn is green in winter. Cattle stand where planters will run in spring. Some plants are eaten, some are trampled, manure is left behind. Hoof prints mark the surface, but underneath those hoof prints the soil is covered. Roots remain in the ground. Water has somewhere to go. And the acres that once sat empty between harvest and planting are doing several jobs at once. One October evening, Daniel's daughter rode with Ray to move the cows. She was 8 years old and responsible for carrying one of the plastic fence posts, though she mostly dragged it. She watched the herd enter a fresh section of rye and asked why they did not let the cows eat the whole field. Ray told her the cows needed food. Then he pointed at the plants they had left behind. He said the soil needed food too. She looked at the ground for a moment. Then she asked which one needed it more. Ray thought about that. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the covered soil. He looked across the same field where, Years earlier, he had been certain his son was about to ruin the ground. Then he said, "That's why we moved them. The cattle are still there. The portable fence is still there. The muddy spot from the first winter is gone, though Daniel keeps a photograph of it in the farm office. He keeps it because good systems are not built by pretending mistakes never happened. They are built by paying attention to what the mistakes were trying to teach." The Mercers did not save their soil by buying one product. They did not find a perfect animal, a perfect seed mix, or a perfect schedule. They connected things the farm had kept separate: crop ground that sat empty, cattle that needed winter feed, plants that could protect the soil, manure that could return nutrients, hooves that could damage wet ground or improve residue contact, depending on when they arrived and how long they stayed. The difference was not the cows. The difference was the decision to manage them as part of the land instead of keeping them outside it. They put cattle on a cornfield, and people thought the hooves would destroy the soil. The first winter, in one wet corner, they nearly did. So the Mercers changed the water, changed the fence, changed the timing, and learned when to move. Then the drought came. The rain stopped. The corn curled. The uncovered ground heated up. But beneath the trampled rye, the soil held moisture a little longer. The crop stayed green a little later, and the field that looked the most damaged in January became the field that handled July better than any of them expected. The cows did not fix the farm. They helped the family learn how the farm's pieces were supposed to work together. And sometimes, that is what recovery looks like. Not a machine arriving, not a miracle product, not a sudden return to the way the land used to be. Sometimes it looks like a herd moving quietly across a green field in the middle of winter, eating half, leaving half, and giving the soil one more reason to keep working.